November 1983, the world came closer to nuclear war than almost anyone realized. Not because of a missile launch, not because of a rogue commander, but because of a military exercise that looked a little too real. On NATO maps, it was just another training event. On Soviet radar screens, it looked like the opening move of World War III. This is the story of Able Archer 83, an exercise that convinced the Soviet Union a nuclear first strike might be coming, and how the world avoided disaster almost by accident. Every year, NATO ran command post exercises to practice how a nuclear war might unfold on paper. Able Archer was one of those drills. In 1983, it simulated the final, terrifying phase of conflict, the moment when political leaders authorized the use of nuclear weapons. New procedures were added, more realistic communications, new codes, even simulated movements of nuclear-capable aircraft. For NATO officers, it was about readiness. For the people running the exercise, it was still just a scenario. But on the other side of the Iron Curtain, those same signals looked like something else entirely. The early steps of a real nuclear strike. The Soviet Union entered the 1980s deeply suspicious of the West. Its leadership believed the United States might one day launch a surprise nuclear attack. To detect that attack before it happened, the KGB created an intelligence program called Operation Ryan. Its goal was simple and terrifying: collect any sign, no matter how small, that the West was preparing for nuclear war. Agents were told to watch everything: government movements, military patterns, even blood donations and factory activity. By 1983, this paranoia had hardened into doctrine. The Soviet leadership didn't just fear a first strike, they expected one. So when NATO began Able Archer, the Soviets were already primed to see danger. Able Archer 83 didn't look like previous exercises. NATO used new, highly realistic communications formats. Messages were encrypted and routed in ways that resembled real wartime traffic. Nuclear-capable aircraft were moved to different bases. Command posts practiced procedures that mirrored actual launch protocols. From NATO's perspective, this was progress. A more serious, more accurate rehearsal. But Soviet intelligence, already on edge, watched these changes with alarm. To them, the increased realism wasn't just a training upgrade. It looked like the West was quietly shifting from exercise to execution. In Moscow, analysts began to ask a dangerous question: what if this wasn't a drill at all? As Able Archer unfolded, the Soviet Union quietly raised the readiness of some of its nuclear forces. In Eastern Europe, aircraft believed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons were placed on higher alert. Warheads were reportedly moved closer to their delivery systems. Certain units were prepared to respond quickly if orders came. None of this was announced. No public speeches, no dramatic threats. Just silent, methodical steps toward the possibility of nuclear war. From the Soviet point of view, they weren't escalating recklessly. They believed they were bracing for a potential surprise attack, one they might only detect at the last possible moment. The world carried on, unaware that the margin for error was shrinking. On the American side, the intelligence picture looked very different. The CIA knew the Soviets were anxious. They knew about Operation Ryan. They understood that Moscow feared a first strike, but they did not fully grasp how the Soviets were interpreting Able Archer in real time. To U.S. analysts, the exercise was routine. They saw no clear signs that the Soviet Union was preparing to launch nuclear weapons. The heightened Soviet alert levels were either missed, misunderstood, or not seen as extraordinary. Both sides were looking at the same world and drawing completely different conclusions. One side thought it was running a drill. The other thought it might be watching the opening moves of Armageddon. As Able Archer reached its peak, the scenario moved into its most sensitive phase, the simulated authorization of nuclear strikes. NATO leaders practiced the procedures they would follow if they ever had to make that decision for real. Messages flowed, commands were issued, the exercise played out as designed. But for Soviet leaders already convinced that the West might hide a real attack inside a drill, this was the moment of maximum danger. If they misread the situation, they risked launching a nuclear war based on a misunderstanding. If they did nothing, and it wasn't a drill, they might be destroyed in a first strike. For a brief window in November 1983, that impossible choice hung in the air. And then, nothing happened. Able Archer ended. NATO units stood down. The simulated war was over. In the Soviet Union, the heightened alert levels quietly eased. No missiles were launched, no orders were given, there was no dramatic phone call, no last-minute negotiation, no public confrontation. The crisis passed not because of a bold diplomatic move, but because both sides, by sheer luck, stopped short of the point of no return. Most of the world never knew how close things had come. It wasn't until years later, when documents were declassified and former officials began to speak, that the full picture emerged. Western analysts realized that the Soviet Union had taken Able Archer far more seriously than anyone in NATO had imagined. Some later described it as one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War, a crisis driven not by open confrontation, but by fear, misreading, and worst-case assumptions. Able Archer became a case study in how close nuclear powers can come to catastrophe without even realizing it at the time. The world hadn't stepped back from the brink because of careful planning. It had stepped back because this time, no one pushed harder. We often imagine nuclear war starting with a clear decision, a leader pressing a button, a deliberate act of aggression. Able Archer tells a different story. It shows how miscommunication, paranoia, and routine military activity can combine into something far more dangerous than anyone intends. In 1983, a training exercise almost became the spark for a real nuclear exchange, not because either side wanted it, but because both sides were afraid of what the other might do. The world survived that week in November by chance as much as by design, and that's what makes Able Archer 83 one of the most unsettling close calls in modern history.